The intersection of ESG and IR, a very important topic that hasn't really been addressed much in our community. I'm joined today by Sally Curley, who's the founder and CEO of Curley Global IR. She is a consortium of consultants that helps companies manage their ESG and other proxy-related functionalities. Sally has been my go-to IR person for quite a while now, today on realtransparentdisclosure.com. So Sally, IR and ESG reporting. ESG reporting is such a huge topic these days, and investor relations continues to be the bread and butter of many companies in terms of them reaching shareholders, reaching investors, of course, as the term implies. So the first question I have for you is, who should own the ESG process? A number of companies, particularly smaller companies, are still grappling with how they're going to do that, including how they collect the data internally and then, what is IR's role in that process?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Brock. And it's one that, depending on the size of the organization and the internal resources available, I think that's what dictates really who owns that ESG or who oversees that ESG process. It's becoming more and more elevated to the C-suite level. But again, that really depends on the size of the organization. Ultimately, the area or the individual that has responsibility for ESG should be somebody that has the title and the gravitas to understand components of ESG, speak with authority on the topic internally and also externally as needed, and then be able to pull together all the internal constituents to achieve the best outcomes. So in my experience in smaller organizations, this could be the general counsel, it could be the head of investor relations, but it's likely a combination of the legal and the IR teams with the environmental health and safety, the EH&S team involvement. In the larger organizations, they could have a dedicated chief sustainability officer or CSO. It could be the chief legal counsel. It could be an investor relations officer. It could be a chief risk officer combined with the head of EH&S and some of the key functional and operational leaders overseeing the efforts. And many organizations have either an ESG working group or an ESG committee. So if you have a committee, it's a formal committee with a charter. In my former organization, what we decided to do was create an ESG committee that effectively reported into the disclosure committee and we staffed it cross-functionally, and I think that worked really well. Myself and the head of EH&S co-chaired it, which also worked really well because if one or the other of us got tied up in something, then you had a co-chair that you could rely on that could still move the committee forward and you wouldn't have to reschedule a committee meeting. Regardless of the size of the organization, IR plays a critical role for, as the go-to for a key stakeholder group, as you mentioned, shareholders. And we're also often involved in governance engagement, which also encompasses ESG discussions on the proxy the compliance side of investment institutions. It impacts the C-suite, it impacts the board, it puts IR in a really critical role in understanding ESG and the company's role in these efforts and disclosures. And in most organizations, the IRO has a seat at the table relative to the disclosure committee, as I mentioned, and therefore plays a key role in advising both from the investor viewpoint as well as from SEC disclosure. And I just want to point out finally, if there are any doubts about the investor relations officer's involvement in ESG, consider that this month that we're taping, the House Financial Services Committee is calling it's known as the ESG month. That committee has 6 hearings in July, followed by a committee vote later this month on Republican-sponsored bills that will seek to limit ESG. And the areas include shareholder proposals, proxy advisory firms, proxy voting, fiduciary responsibilities and duties, climate change, impact of EU sustainability reporting, due diligence requirements on U.S. companies, and most, if not all of those, sit squarely in the wheelhouse of an investor relations officer's responsibilities.
Yeah, ESG month. Whoa. So what is unique about the IRO? What unique attributes do IROs have that lend themselves to be involved in ESG?
Yeah, I think the IRO sits in a seat in the organization that really has a 360-degree view of the of the organization, sometimes in a deeper dive, in a deeper way than even the CEO or the CFO, depending on that investor relations officer's engagement with business leaders. So this perspective combined with engagement across internal constituents allows the IRO to be in a unique position of having data, pointing out areas of opportunity for ESG initiatives, and also for disclosures. And when I was sitting in the executive IR seat, I was brought into customer conversations from time to time, where the EH&S director might have been asked by the chief customer officer to partner with customers on either an environmental or social initiative, for example. And again, because of that relationship with investors and often with the proxy compliance side of the investment institutions, IROs can really provide that reality check on materiality relative to ESG disclosures. And I mentioned before that IR has to interact with so many operational and functional leaders across the organization. That is a role with key internal partnerships and can also provide a holistic view, which is helpful when assessing ESG risks and opportunities. Over the past decade, I would also say that the backgrounds of IROs have shifted as well. They become much more financially based, so derived from either Wall Street or from the finance organization itself, and or IROs have advanced finance degrees like myself. They can assist particularly on disclosure committees and ensuring that any disclosures are reportable, repeatable, and auditable, which is a phrase that my firm, in partnership with attorney Carol Nolan Drake, who I know is your friend and mine, coined and used as a guidepost in client engagements. And then finally, there have been quite a few research studies on the value that investor relations brings to a company's share price. Some research shows as much as 10% for superior IR in an increase in share price, and for poor IR, as much as a 20% decline in share price. So why wouldn't you want a strong investor relations officer involved in ESG to help drive better outcomes and thus improve share price?
So one surprise when I went in-house was how challenging it could be to get along with the various departments that you have to often work with: treasury, financial reporting, investor relations, if you're in the legal department, and actually sometimes the legal department separate from the corporate secretary's department. So now you have this relatively new ESG things, and there might be turf wars, but on the other hand, it actually might be more of, I'm really busy already, I don't need something else on my plate, particularly something that's becoming politically controversial. What was your words of wisdom about how to build collegiality among the interns?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it's really critical. And I don't, unless you're a large organization with quite a few resources, I don't see that changing. It's always going to be a challenge. And even if you are a large organization, you often have other priorities and competing priorities. So I think, again, this is where the IRO can really become a partner to the organization with respect to ESG, because typically a very strong investor relations officer already has deep partnerships, not just with the operational leaders, but with the functional leaders as well. And because of that 360 purview that I just mentioned, that individual, the IRO, has the opportunity to appropriately identify and evaluate, as well as recommend reporting on ESG initiatives. So that cross-organization partnership is really critical to identifying, assessing, and mitigating any ESG relevant risks as well. We saw this just codified in the March 2023 COSO guidelines over sustainability reporting. So I think that by definition or by legislation, you're going to see a focus of the organization and the investor on ESG disclosures, and the investor relations officer is able to help guide that and help really bring the functional and operational leaders together. Also, with the EU mandated disclosures already in place and coming in place, and some of the SEC disclosures already in place, and what we anticipate will be in place over the next 12 to 18 months relative to E&S, I think this will make it more critical for organizations to involve the head of investor relations and leverage those relationships that IRO has in the organization. So just partnering is absolutely critical. It involves not just legal and finance and communications, if that's a separate group, but it's the chief customer officer, it's supply chain. It is your chief people officer for human capital and DEI and employee resource group information. And it can also be your regulatory and government affairs group if you have those separate functions within your organization, and even compliance and risk. There's actually an increased focus from the compliance and risk groups, the associations that I'm seeing, whereas 5 years ago, I will tell you, this wasn't necessarily, again, my experience, this wasn't necessarily on their radar. It's very much on their radar now.
And then let's talk about the primary job of an IRO, targeting investors. How does an IRO target ESG investors?
Yeah, I think for the investors, certainly their impact investing funds, their ESG focused funds, investor relations officers have typically a contact management database that they leverage. And so, and quite a few of these ESG mandated funds have actually public websites and public disclosure. And so they're identifiable through a number of different means, including external sourcing and external third parties that an investor relations officer would have access to. It's just part of their normal daily role in IR. For the sell side, and for those that aren't familiar with the sell side, buy side nomenclature, the sell side are the ones that publish on the organization, typically with the rating. There's several companies who have emerged as leaders in ESG coverage, and this won't be an exhaustive list, but just to name a few, they're Barclays, Cowen, Morgan Stanley, RBC. Each one of those actually hosts an ESG-focused conference, and so that's a great way to get in front of ESG funds and fund managers, is to try to connect with one of those ESG coverage analysts. Getting coverage or an invitation is going to depend on your relationship with the investment bank, just as it would with any traditional investor relations sell-side coverage approach. And of course, there are dozens of ESG conferences and summits that aren't necessarily investor focused, but are certainly ESG and sustainability focused. We've got the New York Climate Week, we've got the Economist UK Summit, the Conference of Parties. There is a Oxford University Sustainability Summit that I attend from time to time. These are some of the other notable ESG conferences and summits which investors sometimes go to, but they're not necessarily billed specifically as an investor relations or an investor-focused conference.
And then when it comes to activism, I know that some of the activists are using the E and S levers as tools to help them in their putting pressure on companies. What's the IRO's role in that?
Yeah, well, Brock, as you know quite well, we experienced a proliferation of E&S proposals in 2021 and 2022. And then in 2023, we saw a slight decline in the number of proposals. We also saw a decline in the support for the proposals. But at the same time, the rate of SEC declines relative to no action requests was higher than in the past. So it could be due to the fact that E&S proposals were negotiated out of a proxy and we never actually saw them in the proxy, combined with the anti-ESG backlash that we've seen over the last year or two, that may have initiated a pause for some investors. I'd say still the same. I expect that ESG is indeed here to stay. IROs would be best to monitor their shareholdings very, very closely. The funds that have been established as ESG focused funds or impact investing funds are not going away. They have a mandate to find environmental and social and governance appropriate equity opportunities for investment. There are a number of new shareholder activist firms that you've noted who take both sides of the agenda, both pro and anti-ESG. I think knowing who these firms are, how they operate, is critical for investor relations officers. And I expect that climate, human capital, DEI reporting, political spend oversight, typically in a presidential year and coming into a presidential voting year, as well as pay for performance, will continue to be favorite topics of ESG activism. And finally, I have to put in a plug for the new NAREID Standards of Disclosure, which includes a chapter on ESG disclosure. And it's available for both members and non-members of NERI at the NERI.org website.
I was not aware of that at all. Yeah, I think for many of the countries out there right now and states in the US, the climate events that are happening are really going to hopefully wake up people. And I think we're going to see more and more activism and different kinds of activism, maybe once we get past next year's presidential election, but time is of the essence. So we'll
Absolutely.
see what happens. Great stuff as always, Sally. Thanks for being the go-to IR person.
Thank you, Brock, so much.